The Sony ZV-E10. That name makes it sound like an electric car, but it's a camera, and it's a pretty damn good one in my opinion. It's got a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor that shoots raw photos, really good looking 4K footage up to 30 frames per second, and HD footage that goes all the way up to 120 frames per second. It's got a bunch of features that you would expect, from any modern mirrorless camera system, and some that might surprise you, and we're gonna get into all of it. So will this be the new beginner to intermediate camera that I recommend to everybody? It's been the Canon M50 for so long. Or is this camera just another one to kind of forget about? We gotta talk about everything the camera does first before we can answer that question. And there's gonna be timestamps below if you just wanna skip around, get to the information that's important to you. The build quality is solid. I think Sony did a good job with the ZV-E10. The grip feels good. The textures on the body feel professional and rugged for an affordable camera. And it's so small, which is great if you wanna be walking around, traveling, putting it on a gimbal. It's very lightweight, very small. Unfortunately, because the camera is so small, there wasn't room to put an EVF on it, I guess. And there were many times where I went to shoot video with the EVF and it just didn't exist. So that was a bit of a bummer because I really like using EVFs, even for video. It offers more stabilization and it's just easier when it's really bright outside. You do have the screen to use for video and photo, but it's not the highest quality. You can get away with it, and there's focus peaking for manual focusing with video. So it's not terrible, but it's also just not great quality. I really want mirrorless cameras to upgrade the screens. It's time to move forward with that. And one thing I really liked is the menu button is on the same side as your scroll wheel, your record button. Those are kind of all on the same side. On the A7S III, this $3,500 beast that I'm using, the menu button is on the top left side of the camera. And a lot of times I don't want to use two hands because I might be doing something else with my left hand. It's just really convenient having the menu button on the right side. I know that's really particular, but that's how I feel. One cool feature of this camera is the onboard mic. So basically the camera comes with a little cold shoe windscreen that you can mount onto your camera so that there's not a ton of wind noise if you just want to use the built-in microphone. Now, this is not gonna sound as good as using something like a professional mic or a shotgun mic on your camera like a Rode, but for people who want their camera set up as small and discreet as possible, this is a really solid option. You can just turn the camera on and start recording, and it sounds like this. Now we have record levels set to 15 with the built-in mic. We have IBIS on, we're shooting in PP off. Looks like it's being pretty smooth at the moment, pretty cool. Oh, right. All right, it's IBIS time. Is it good in this camera? Well, it's pretty good, actually. It has active IBIS, it's got standard stabilization, and you can just turn it off if you want. When using the active IBIS, it's pretty solid, but there is a significant crop in on the sensor to get that stabilized look. And even with active IBIS on, you do have to be careful with how much movement you're adding to the camera's footage. If you don't have really steady hands, you might still see a little bit of warping in your footage. So, you can use lenses with optical stabilization, like the kit lenses have, some of them do. Or you can just be careful with how you hold the camera, stay as steady as possible, and you'll get pretty good, stable results with the IBIS in this camera. You just have to be careful, because once you start moving this camera around, especially in the 4K modes, there's a lot of rolling shutter. And when you add IBIS on top of a lot of movement and a sensor that has a lot of rolling shutter, you can just get some really weird, warpy images. So, stable is best if you're using the IBIS in this camera. We gotta talk about autofocus. Sony is one of the top contenders. Most of us agree that Canon and Sony are up here as the kings of autofocus, and the ZV-E10 is no exception. It's really solid, and it's awesome to know that even in 1080, shooting at 120 frames per second, the autofocus is still very reliable, which is cool. You can kind of just turn this camera on, put face tracking on, or have it in a wide zone, and you can pretty much count on it to keep your subject in focus, so you can just, work on getting a good looking shot. The face tracking is really solid, and then there's also this mode called Product Showcase. You may have heard about this already, but basically you can hold up a product like this battery, not directly in front of your face, and it will recognize you're holding a product and focus on that instead of putting it in front of your face to, cancel face tracking. The product showcase mode doesn't work all the time. It's kind of hit or miss. Most of the time it's good enough, but also it's fine to just hold something in front of your face and let it focus on it. As my camera doesn't do it. I would just personally use the face tracking and hold something in front of your face if you want to show off a product while talking at the same time. But you do you. Test it out for yourself, boo-boo, okay? Another new kind of computational feature in the ZV-E10 is the background defocus. So if you have a lens, like a kit lens that doesn't have a lot of depth of field, you can turn on background defocus and it will add digitally blur to your background so you can get this nice bokeh-y delicious look that everybody wants. Problem is it doesn't work super consistently, at least when me and Connor were testing it. And we tested it in an environment with tons of natural light. It looked really great there, but still, like, we would turn on the background defocus mode and it would make our image super dark sometimes. And then other times when I would point at a different angle, it would just blur out the background, do what it's supposed to. It didn't seem super reliable, and also you don't really need a super blurry background all the time. Another thing we pretty much all know about Sony cameras is their low light performance is incredible. And the ZV-E10 is also good in low light. I threw it on a tripod in my car and drove around at night and just cranked the ISO to different settings. So you can see those results on the screen right now. And even in S-Log3 in this camera, which is the flattest profile, it still performed relatively well, even when cranking up the ISO like to the 3200 to 6400 range. It looked pretty good. And even when you get way up there in the ISOs, the noise patterns aren't big and blotchy like they were on old DSLR cameras. The noise is smaller, so it's not gonna look as gross and like nasty as old cameras did. You can still kind of get away with hiding it in the color grade or using some denoise in your program if you want to. But also when you throw it on YouTube, it gets even more compressed and sometimes images look cleaner on YouTube. I've noticed that about my footage. Sometimes noisy images looked cleaner on YouTube because it was more compressed when I put it up there. So it's not an issue. It's good in low light, just so you know. The most important part when getting low light footage is just continuing to expose correctly. You don't ever want to underexpose your footage and then bring it up later in post. When you bring up that exposure in post, that's where noise starts to really show itself. You want to keep your exposure correct, even in low light situations. You can always make a shot look darker in post and it will be cleaner that way. Now let's talk about the image quality. And I know this camera is marketed more toward beginners, you know, getting their first camera or maybe like a second camera for people. So having like pristine Hollywood image quality isn't the goal anyway. But surprisingly, I think this camera's footage looks really nice. There are a ton of different color profiles you can choose from. If you're just starting out, I noticed that the PP off profile, which technically isn't a profile because it's off, PP off looks pretty good, even though I usually prefer my PP on. Also, the Cine profiles look good on this camera. I know a lot of people that shoot Sony prefer the Cine profiles, you know, Cine 4. And you can customize all these to be more flat or less saturated, more saturated. You can do a lot of different things with these. And then you can also go to S-Log 2 or 3 to get that ultra flat, higher dynamic range color profile where you can practice color grading and, you know, tweaking all your settings if you want to get maximum dynamic range out of this camera. And even though this camera is all 8-bit internal, there's less color information there, you can still get good results. As long as you're exposing relatively correctly and, you know, not pushing your color grade like crazy, you can still get great looking images in log in 8-bit as long as you're being safe. Safe color grading, kids. When you're editing the footage from the ZV-E10, you do have to be a little bit careful because if you're shooting in the 4K modes, it plays back pretty sluggish on my computer at least. I'm using an M1 MacBook Pro, and that can usually handle my A7S III footage really well. And I shoot in 10-bit 420. I don't know, the ZV-E10 was just a lot harder on my computer for some reason. The HD slow motion footage did play back pretty smoothly. So I don't know, depending on what you use, you might have to make proxies, or you can use Sony's built-in proxy recording function if you want to record your clips and then proxy versions of your clips at the same time, and then link them in your editor for smooth editing. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm sorry, just look up proxy workflow on YouTube. But by far the biggest downfall in the image quality of this camera is the rolling shutter, which we've already mentioned. So you just have to be careful to not move your camera around super fast, especially in 4K. Your lines that are supposed to look like this will start looking like this if you introduce a lot of motion, and you know, nobody wants that. I was gonna add a sound effect of my neck like breaking, but it did on its own. So that's where we're at. So is this camera good or nah? I do think this is a step forward in the Sony APS-C line of cameras. I've used the a6400, I've used the a6600, and I wasn't a fan of either one really. It didn't compel me to want to switch to Sony at that time. The rolling shutter was atrocious on both of those cameras too, and that's really the thing that Sony needs to fix. I really hope in their next APS-C release that they get that rolling shutter down, like put a faster processor in the camera so it has better readout speed and everything, because that's really what's holding these back in my opinion. But even with some of those flaws like rolling shutter, the pros of the ZV-E10 highly outweigh the cons in my opinion and make this a worthwhile beginner to intermediate camera that can be useful for a ton of different people. So after weeks of therapy and after recording this video, I think I'm finally ready to accept the fact that the ZV-E10 is now gonna be my highest recommendation for people who DM me and say, what should I get? I'm looking for my first camera. I kind of want to get one too because I want to make some gaming content this fall when Halo Infinite comes out. So I might be looking to get a ZV-E10 as well. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Make sure to subscribe if you want to be a subscriber. Join the Discord below to become an honorary member of the Zachy May fam. Like the video because one like equals one Canon M50 forever forgotten. That's a joke, the M50's fine. And check out the description below to see things like my Instagram, my merch like Fuji Juice hats and Cranon hats. And as always, please text me when you get home so I know you're safe. I've been worried about you. And I love you. I'll see you in the next one.